I want to take a moment today to talk about the comments recently by Police Chief Ken James. I'm referring to the comments where he said that they're seeking reasonable gun restrictions and that guns are not for defense, that guns do not serve a defensive purpose, that is a myth, and that they are strictly an offensive weapon. Well, I wanted to address these two statements and point out how ridiculous they are, just how absurd and how intellectually dishonest they are. First off, I want to address one of my biggest pet peeves, and that is this whole idea that if you just put the word reasonable in front of something, it somehow makes sense. I really don't think you all understand the meaning of the word reasonable. Reasonable would mean if you say, okay, I have a reasonable gun restriction here, reasonable would mean you can then sit down and point to how you reasonably believe this restriction will actually achieve the goal of reducing violence. Now, when you have even Joe Biden going out and admitting that nothing we're doing is actually going to affect violence, well, then you negate the use of the word reasonable. There's nothing reasonable about it. I believe the word you're looking for is reactionary, not reasonable. You just don't seem to understand the definitions. Just sticking the word reasonable in front of something doesn't make it by default reasonable, doesn't make it by default a good thing. You can't sit and say, I would like to reinstate a reasonable amount of slavery. It doesn't make slavery reasonable just because you stuck the word in front of it. That prefix does not somehow change the meaning of the other words. And the prefix alone is not enough. You have to be able to justify the prefix. So my whole point about that is stop using the word reasonable when you can't actually reason out your thought process. If you can't reason through what you're saying, then it's by definition not reasonable. Now next, let's address his statements about firearms. Now there were several things he said that really bothered me about firearms, and I'll get to all of them here. One that he said is that they don't serve a defensive purpose. Now we'll get to that more in depth later, but saying firearms don't serve a defensive purpose is one of the most ridiculous and dishonest statements I've ever heard someone say. Anyone who sits down and looks at the numbers and is reasonable, like you like to use the word reasonable so much, you'll see that handguns in the United States are 100 times more likely to be used in defense than offense. So just to say that is ridiculous. It is the same level of intellectual dishonesty that would lead someone to say that cars aren't actually for transportation. They're for smashing into things and killing people. Because occasionally they do that. But usually they're for transportation. So that is akin to saying that guns aren't for defense because they usually are used for defense. So you can't just discount reality because it meets your perception, because it serves your agenda to do so. That is completely dishonest. I also want to talk about how he said, well, police officers were scared because of these guns out here. It's scary when we encounter these guns. Well, if you're a police officer and you have the weight of a badge, you have your weapons, everything with you, and you're still frightened by bad guys with guns, well, what do you think about civilians that have to face these bad guys with guns while we're waiting for you to show up? Do you have no regard for them at all? It's just ridiculous to state that, we're afraid we're going to be killed because 55 police officers a year are killed by guns, which I'll cover that statistic more in a second here. And we are being killed even though we have our badges and our guns and our backup and our squad cars and our shotguns, and we're still being killed, so we're frightened. But we think the best way to deal with that situation is to make you have to deal with the same situation with no guns. That is just absurd, it is elitist, and it is pathetic. And let's look at that number of 55 officers on average killed every year. Well, the number I found was actually 52 officers killed on average every year. And 5% of those people were killed off-duty when involved in bar fights, domestic disputes, lots of other things that didn't have anything to do with the actual performance of their duty. But let's just assume that number itself is a valid number. Let's even assume your number, 55, is a valid number. There's over 800,000 full-time officers in the United States. 800,000. So 55 officers dying from gun violence when there's 800,000 of you. This is supposed to be a dangerous job. Let's remember that. You're not a crossing guard. You're a police officer. So that gives you a 0.006% chance of dying at a handgun. That's what? That's 1,000th of 1% of a chance of dying at a handgun. If that percentage has you paralyzed in fear that you can't perform your duty, get another job. Become a crossing guard. You're not suited for the job you're doing now. And let's just say if you're that terrified by guns with that statistic, then you should be scared as hell of getting in your squad car. Your cruiser kills more police officers than guns do. Automobile accidents is the number one cause of death in police officers while they're on duty. So the whole statistical thing of being so terrified of guns is ridiculous. You wouldn't get rid of your squad car because it serves a greater purpose. So why would you get rid of guns when they obviously serve a much greater purpose? And finally, let's address the whole firearms as an offensive weapon and not a defensive weapon. Well, you're partly right. Firearms are an offensive weapon. I've maintained that position for the longest time. They are very much so an offensive weapon. They're also a defensive weapon. Offense and defense isn't an intrinsic quality in an item. It's how it's used. One more thing about guns as an offensive weapon for officers. If that's your mindset, if that's what you think, then you have a gross misunderstanding of what being a police officer means. Your badge is your authority to perform your job, which is to protect the population and to enforce the laws. Your gun is to defend yourself in the performance of those duties. Your gun is not an item for you to intimidate or to offend against the population that you're sworn to protect. If that's what you think, if you think that is the main purpose of your firearm, then you do not need to be in law enforcement. You need to find another job. Maybe I would suggest mall security. So to sit and try to pretend that firearms are not defensive weapons when they have throughout history defended our persons, our property, and our nation. I mean, the historical use of firearms as a defensive item is boundless. You just cannot stop finding examples of it because they were used in a means to protect ourselves, not to be offensive against someone else. Therefore, by definition, they have served a defensive purpose. Every time a soldier stands guard with a firearm at our borders and protects our country, that is a defensive use of a firearm. Every time someone uses a handgun to defend their home against an intruder, that is a defensive use of a firearm. You may want to call it an offensive weapon, which it is, but it's still being used for defensive purposes. It's been used for defensive purpose throughout history. And today, firearms are the best defense of our freedoms. The concepts of offense and defense are not just things you can separate. They're intertwined. Because let's not forget, the best defense is a good offense, and the best offense is a good defense. The best defense against being attacked is the person attacking you knowing that you can take care of yourself, that you can defend yourself, that you have something that will equalize the situation. Because no one wants a victim that fights back. Everybody wants an easy target. And in the end, my message to Chief Ken James is there's only two options here. Either you are a deceitful, duplicitous, dishonest person who's willing to push their own personal agenda over serving the population that they are sworn to serve and protect, or you're mentally, physically, and emotionally incapable of performing your duties. You're just not suited for the job you're holding. Either way, someone else needs to be doing the job.